Ship crewman, what was the creepiest experience you had out on the ocean? Not a ship, but in the movies, the creaking sounds on a submarine from the pressure when going deep? The first time you hear them for real is a bit unnerving. Story 2. Worked for a bit as a deckhand on fishing boats out of San Diego. A few times we would come across deserted smaller boats, pangas, drifting with outlandishly big motors. Every time the captain would just cut hard port or starboard to get away from them as quick as possible. I knew they were substances running boats that had probably dropped off their cargo, but I would check them out with the binoculars if we were close. One had 2 people on it. Both had clearly been shot a bunch of times, and one was moving and fairly alive. I told the captain, got a disapproving head shake, and we were on our way. Story 3. Deep fog like I couldn't see the front of the yacht, sailing, and it was only 50 feet. The real creepy part came from the radar system tracking the boats and ships around us. Our radar, not being a commercial shipping or fisherman spec, was not quite as accurate, so sometimes boats would disappear, be right on top of us, or appear in sight, but not on radar. That, on top of the sheer quantity of marine debris throughout the ocean, made me really scared that some boats had sunk when they dropped off radar. Story 4. The doldrums. You spend a year or two at sea watching the waves and winds are blowing constantly, and then one day they stop. Not so much as a whisper of wind, and the sea is like glass. It feels as if time has stopped. Realizing how creepy it feels, the captain calls for an all-stop and goes dead in the water. Like a horror movie, everyone migrates topside and just stares to the horizon. No one says a word, and you can hear yourself breathe. He lets the ship rest there for an hour, and the sailors freak out. Panic can set in quickly with a green crew. The only thing the captain says when we get underway is men. This is the doldrums, idiot knew what he was doing. Story 5. I got to see glowing algae on top of the ocean in the middle of the night, having a smoke on the upper decks after my watch on a warship. Surreal and extremely uncommon, but a memory I'll have for the rest of my life. Story 6. Not a crewman myself, but I'm fortunate enough to know a lovely guy called Ron Warwick, who was the captain of Cunard's Queen Elizabeth II-liner for years. I once asked him what the oddest thing he'd ever seen at sea was. His reply was precisely this. I saw a wave once. It was quite big. I have to say I was a bit disappointed. I mean, we've all seen big waves. But a mutual friend suggested I look it up. It turns out Ron was talking about this monster, rogue wave, giant single waves that occur in the ocean 20, 30 meters high, with behavior that is not typical for sea waves. Killer waves are dangerous for ships and offshore structures. Story 7. Came upon an empty life raft in the middle of the Atlantic. In all likelihood, it was probably an accidental discharge. Maybe a crew member was ducking around with the release or something, who knows. The implications otherwise are very disturbing though. Did a ship go down with all hands without anyone making it to the raft? Was the raft abandoned for some reason? It left me feeling vaguely disturbed for a while afterwards. Story 8. U.S. Marine here during a float on a boat to operation. Top secret, destination, unknown. One of our own were lost at sea. I guess they just jumped overboard at night or something. Kind of depressing. That's a crafty way to die. Anyways, their coffin rack was adjacent to mine, and we left the rack made. And for some reason, the sheets kept on getting messed up every day. It was pain in the ass to keep making the sheets. We stripped the rack. And we figured that no one should be sleeping in there since there were plenty of other vacant racks in the berthing. But someone would keep making the rack and messing the sheets up in the morning. I know aircraft carriers are big, but could someone really fake their own death on one and get away with it? There's no way someone would be sleeping there because we'd notice someone climbing up on the top bunk. And the duty would have been posted at the entrances to the berthing. It was just creepy seeing the rack being made neatly and then messed up in the morning. Story 9. Cousin is a ship captain or something. One time they were loading cargo from Bandar Abbas Bay in Iran to transport to Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. A cat had climbed on board without anyone noticing. Halfway through the Persian Gulf, she began meowing like crazy, and they all legit got spooked. Some started saying ghosts or thinking they were legit sailing in haunted waters. After 3 hours of shipmates searching like crazy, they finally found her hiding between cargo containers. They dropped her off in Abu Dhabi as an illegal immigrant. Story 10? Not ship crew, but one of 3 guys sailing a 45-foot Morgan from Antigua to Daytona Beach, Florida. I had 0 crossing experience prior to this trip. I pictured getting tan, pina coladas, and white sand beaches. Nope, it was open ocean, at least by landlubber standards, and 3-hour shifts round the clock manning the helm, global positioning system, and radar, while the other 2 guys chilled during the day or slept at night. It was very hard, and I've done a few things considered somewhat tough and out of the ordinary. The biggest worry while on autopilot are the bazillions of ships flying around throughout the Caribbean. Yes, you can see them from many miles away, especially at night and with the help of radar, but they sneak up on you. And a 600-foot freighter captained by a possibly hammered crewman in the wheelhouse at 2 in the morning wouldn't even feel a bump as it split us into kindling. So, one night I'm on shift, trying to stay awake with Snickers and coffee, and it's so black you couldn't discern the horizon line. Just stars, blackness, and the running lights of lots of far-off freighters going in all directions. I proceed to take my occasional 360-degree glance around like I was told to make sure there's also nothing coming up aft. And man, there's this giant, round, yellow light stretching what seemed like across the entire sky directly behind me. Clearly, this was a freighter, directly behind our boat, with some kind of a spotlight on the bow trained on us and about to gobble us up like Jonah. The rush of terror was so great, I couldn't even stomp on the deck to awaken my mates, let alone scream for help. So I just accepted my impending death and wondered if it would be the impact or drowning that killed me first. Then I focused a little harder and realized it wasn't a ship at all. It was a full moon rising. I can't describe the immediate relief. It was like awaking from the most terrifying dream you've ever had and realizing, I'm not running from Freddy Krueger. I'm in my bed. Sailing a crossing like that, I learned, is hours and hours and sometimes days and days of endless boredom punctuated. Story 11. I don't know if this was creepy exactly, but it sure scared us. Up by Alaska in rough seas. Our office was below the waterline, on the outside of the ship, right below a sponson. There was a full-size I-beam running around the outside edge of the office. It was probably 10 inches wide, and we used it as a shelf, storing full-size binders on it. One day, in rough weather, 6 of us were in the office, 3 officers, 3 enlisted, when we heard an enormous bang, so loud that our ears rang, and all of us jumped out of our seats. After checking to make sure we weren't taking on water and calling damage control, we started looking around to determine what could have caused it. We couldn't find anything. Nothing had come loose. Nothing had fallen. The dry tank below the office was still dry, etc. We eventually noticed that the I-beam had cracked. Not a hairline fracture, not a little split, but the entire beam had separated lengthwise by about 5 mm. We took a wave up under the sponson with so much energy that it bowed in the hull of the ship and split the beam. But the beam didn't ever go back to the original length. The crack was also precise and even. You could slide a pencil in the gap all the way back to the bulkhead. In fact, the split was so wide they couldn't weld it directly closed. They had to cut a 5 mm shim to fill the gap. It was amazing, and we had hundreds of people come through the office for the next couple of weeks to see it. A couple of people tried to calculate the energy needed to instantly separate the I-beam that was 4 feet away from where we were sitting, but it was too scary to contemplate. Story 12. A friend, a captain, asked me to help deliver a sailboat from Fort Lauderdale to Houston. I was a somewhat inexperienced sailor. Only sailed for fun a few times, short trips. But he was able to get me $100 a day, so I said, why not? I was between jobs. It was 3 of us. Me, my captain, who was a very experienced sailor, and the new owner of the ship. Once we got to Anna Maria Island on the west coast of Florida, we prepared for the longest haul of our trip. The first time we'll be away from the coast, going through the Gulf of Mexico. We did a 4-hour shift. Then you'd get to sleep, or do whatever for 8 hours until your next 4 hours. The eerie part for me was my shift. Alone, pitch black darkness in the middle of the ocean, no moon out. You also have to avoid a lot small oil rigs, some still active, some not active, some marked with lights, some not. You'd hear explainable sounds, etc. I don't know if it was just my head ducking with me, but that one overnight shift was pretty tense and scary for me. Towards the end of my shift, we hit some pretty bad rain and rough seas. My captain took over. I went to bed. I get woken up a bit later to crazy rough seas. I go back on deck, and my captain and the owner of the ship just yell, "We have to turn back! We lost our global positioning system!" Apparently the wind knocked it off the top of the mast and into the ocean. So there we are now, rough seas, pitch black, and with no global positioning system. Luckily, my captain is old school and knows how to sail with just a chart, so we made it back to Anna Maria and purchased a new global positioning system. The whole event was just surreal, and I was definitely worried a few times. The rest of the trip was uneventful. The next nights had nice bright moons, calm seas, and that made it a little less eerie. Story 13. People in real life finding out and thinking I'm crazy, even though I've never told anyone this story before. Me and 2 friends go down and rent a boat on Lake Okeechobee in Florida. We get a 30-foot pontoon boat that has a cover, although there's no cabin or anything under the main deck. It's winter in South Florida, so it's cool, but not cold. Thus, we decide to just sleep on the boat instead of setting up a camp. We plan on spending 3 days and 2 nights on the lake. We spend our time drinking, fishing, and playing games. It's sometime on the 2nd night when I just wake up. I'm still drunk from our previous activities, but my senses are on overdrive, and I just feel aware of something. I was sleeping towards the back of the boat while my friends are at the front. It's eerily calm with no waves in the water. We were about 250 feet from shore with land on our port side. I started scanning the tree line looking for something. Nothing on land, so I scanned the water on the port side. Nothing. So I scanned the water aft of the boat. Nothing. I didn't want to disturb my friends up front, so I scanned the water on the starboard side. That's when I saw it. A skull floating in the water, looking right at me about 50 feet away. An immediate sense of dread took me. It was the most scared I'd ever been in my life. Then an even worse feeling took over. Calmness and the sudden urge to jump in the water. I had the notion that I would be at home and at peace if I just jumped into the water. Before I could act on it, I think one of my friends stirred in their sleep because I heard a beer bottle start rolling near the front of the boat. This snapped me out of it, and the feeling of dread returned. I yelled at them to get up while I moved to start the engines. One doesn't respond at all while the other drunkenly tells me to duck off. I yell again that I'm not damn around and nothing. I'm about to pull the starter on the engine. Yell again at my friends when I hear something. I freeze and listen closely. A very faint splashing sound that is slowly getting closer. I forget about yelling at my friends and focus on starting the engine. I pull and pull and pull on the started and nothing. In between the pulls, I hear the splashing getting closer, but I don't dare look at the direction of the noise. Finally, the engine starts and I punch it out of there. I must have gone 30 miles before I came to a stop to conserve fuel. Until the sun rose and my friends woke up, I spent the rest of the night scanning the waters just in case. I had to make up a bullcrap excuse to explain to my friends why we were so far away from our previous spot. I wanted to tell them, but I doubt they would believe me. This was over 6 years ago, and I have yet to set foot near any body of water larger than my shower. No lakes, oceans, rivers, water parks, pools, hot tubs, nothing. I don't blame you if you don't believe some random guy on the internet. Many times I tried to write it off as my drunk self seeing things. However, I can't write off the feeling of wanting to jump into the water with something real or not that struck me with terror just a moment ago. Thinking about that feeling of wanting to go into the water with whatever was out there chills me to this day.
Story 14.
Not me, but my chief engineer always recalls a story of when a one-man passed away while cleaning a cargo tank due to the fumes. He said, having lunch with him a few minutes prior to everyone running out on deck to see what the emergency was to only make it there as his lifeless body was dragged out. The manhole was the eeriest feeling ever. They were well offshore as well, so their only option was to store his body in one of the walk-in coolers. Made getting your milk in the morning for your cereal very difficult. Story 15. My dad told me this story once. He spent a year fishing off the coast of Alaska. One night, he and another boat were racing to get the last slip. The other would have to moor in the harbor for the night. That night there was a storm, and the fish in the bottom of the boat moored in the harbor all slid to one side and capsized the boat. My dad woke up the next morning to find the entire boat's crew had drowned in their sleep. Story 16. We did a man-overboard drill on the way to Hawaii, which includes throwing a dummy into the water. I went portside to see the experience in less than 1 minute, and by the time I reached the water, there was already a 8-foot shark waiting near the dummy. Story 17. Not creepy, but gross. I was chumming and cutting bait at 5 a.m. on Jeffrey's Ledge in New England. I kept hearing weird splashing sounds every few minutes, but it was still dark. I was a newbie at the time. Around 530, I could see a little better, but not great. I think I kept seeing a buoy looking like a giant road cone popping up out of the water. Then it would disappear again. I was full on what the heck. Captain comes out on deck and catches me staring off into the sea. He looks out. The road cone pops up a few hundred yards off. He looks back at me and starts laughing his ass off. How long you been watching that whale pleasure himself? Humpback whales pleasure himself by rolling around on the surface of the water using the splash as friction. Story 18. I sail on tall ships with temp crews of young people. 16, 18 years old usually. We discourage ghost, creepy stories because there's always some kid who gets inspired and takes it too far. And between rig climbing and weather and the general danger of being at sea, we really don't want that. So no outright creepy stuff, but the sea can be plenty eerie. Being in thick fog and hearing sounds that seem close by, but usually aren't, can be pretty chilling. Buoys that have sound signals can sound spooky as hell. The way the eye tries to make sense of distances when the sea is mostly flat can be really alarming. Look out. I thought that thing was a mile off and now it is at our bow. Then there is the time we were in the middle of the Atlantic and the main anchor started letting out just after I came off evening watch. I dashed out of the mess and onto the foredeck to ram on the brakes, which turned out later to be about 3 seconds before the anchor and chain combined would have been too heavy to haul back in. We had been pounding in an 8-meter swell for days, so I assumed the brakes and the slip must have just rattled loose in the relentless motion. But the bosun swore up and down that he double secured the slip with rope and that there was no way it could have come loose on its own. Story 19. I worked as a deckhand on a private 53-foot yacht. I helped deliver it from the east coast of the U.S. to the Virgin Islands with a pit stop in Bermuda. En route to Bermuda, I wake up a head up to accompany the guy on watch, and he looks pretty disturbed and points up. Our cockpit had a cloth bimini with a plastic window in the top. Roof thing over the helm for you non-nautical folks. On the plastic window are 2 boot prints in the salt residue. There's no way anyone could stand on the bimini. It's cloth and would have broken. We never figured out how it happened, and the captain brushed it off, prob, so I wouldn't be freaked out since it was my first time at sea. Not terrifying, definitely weird. It could have been a prank, but no one was laughing, and who would risk losing their boots overboard for a stupid prank? Story 21. First day, on my first ship ever. It's winter and like 30 degrees, and the steel bulkheads, racks, beds are cold. Shipmate is nice enough to give me a small electric alarm clock to use the next morning. I climb in my rack and put the alarm over my head, kind of under the pillow, and crash. 2 a.m. I wake up after feeling something weird. Something just ran across my boot camp shaved head. I open my eyes and stare into the darkness. Then something else runs across my head. I turn on my overhead light in my rack, and about 24 roaches run for their lives. They were nesting on my alarm clock and my head to keep warm. Yes. This was a new guy joke. Yes. I used it later on someone else. No, it was almost 30 years ago, and I haven't forgotten. I still feel them sometimes. 2. Same ship, out at sea. Took a shortcut through the civilians' berthing, bedrooms area. About 15 of them were sitting around a TV watching adult film. Some were laughing, but others were too focused. Those others. 3. Another ship, out at sea. When emergencies happen, it doesn't matter who you are. Sometimes you have to get dirty. And line ruptured and flooded several spaces with pitch black oil. About neck high. On top of that, we were sure there were a few bodies in there. Me and a buddy had to climb into the oil pool and wade through 2 rooms to get the pumps placed and confirm other things. Power is cut off, of course, so we had nothing but flashlights. Yes, we found one of the bodies. The other guy was actually elsewhere napping on the job. Probably saved his own life. There's plenty more, but those are the first 3. Story 21. I was on a research vessel south of the Solomon Islands after a cyclone had torn the place to shreds. Come 3 a.m. it's time to lower the instrument and turn on the searchlights over the quarterdeck. The ocean surface is awash with coconut palms, bits of wood, outdoor furniture, and so on. The islands had been swept clean and the ship was sitting in a vast field of floating debris. Mesmerized by this, I kept staring at it all when I noticed a small pink shape with what appeared to be arms, legs, and a head. My heart almost stopped beating. Closer inspection revealed it was a child's doll, but for those few seconds. Story 22. My buddy and I were about 20 miles west of the Lower Keys, in the Gulf of Mexico. We were on his Bertram, looking for dolphin and wahoo, when we see a boat in the distance, heading our direction. We weren't under power or anything, just drifting and drinking beer. The boat gets closer and we see smoke. It was pretty much a burned-out cabin at that point, but still running. It just idled by. We yank our lines up and go run it down. Luckily, no charred corpses, that I could see. I kick it into neutral with a gaff, and we decided to see where it came from. On the way, we reported its location to Coast Guard. We drove that general direction for probably 10 miles. Didn't see a single thing. No other boats, no life jackets, nothing. Hopefully, the people who were on that boat were picked up safety. It was like something from Walking Dead, just a burned-out boat floating on by. Story 23. I was sailing as a cadet on a 1,000-foot-plus container ship crossing the Atlantic during the middle of winter, leaving the Mediterranean heading to Halifax. We were in 40, 50-foot seas. I was sent to check the side port, a hatch on the side of the ship used for taking on stores or a pilot. Our sister ship had a case where her side port was leaking during rough seas. I went down 11 stories to the engine room and took the tunnel to the side port. The ship has 2 tunnels that run the length of the ship from the engine room at the stern all the way forward to the windlass at the bow. As I was in the tunnel, I looked all the way forward, nearly 1,000 feet forward. I could see the ship twisting as we took each wave. Steel was moaning so loudly that it was extremely unnerving to a new mariner. What I saw in the side port was more unnerving. Every time we took a wave, water would rush through the cracks. Luckily, there was a bilge pump to take care of that. My job over the next few days was making sure the pump was keeping up. Story 24. Found a sailboat adrift after a storm in the Atlantic with nobody aboard. We decided to tow it to Florida. A couple of us went aboard to attach the line. There was a foot of water and tons of adult magazines. Never found out who the owner was. Reported it in Key West and left it in the harbor. Story 25. 2 stowaways decided that it would be a good idea to crawl up the anchor chain of our Panama tanker. To give you an idea, each link weighs 365 pounds, and hide in the anchor chain locker. We relocated on order of port authorities and redropped anchor. Dropping anchor is basically that. You just let gravity do its thing, with a bit of braking. Next thing we know is that red mush is coming out of the hawse hole. Basically, those guys were stuck in a room where 365-pound pieces of steel are thrown everywhere. Story 26. Halfway through an 8-month deployment, we found ourselves in a dense fog in the middle of calm seas. The way the fog was sitting made it look like a soft white sand beach was about 30 feet away from the ship. I had such a strong urge to jump off the ship and swim to that little white sand beach that I had to force myself to go below deck. I knew deep down that there was no beach, but my eyes and brain were telling me that was what I was looking at. And the peace I imagined sitting on that little beach was incredibly tempting. Story 27. This was over 30 years ago. We were living aboard a 22 feet our first boat. We pulled into a dock and were trying to sleep. We heard the crackling sound, almost like twigs burning. was very concerning. I was trying to figure out what was wrong with my boat. Our neighbor didn't help. He said it was fiberglass worms. Apparently, this is some mollusk that attaches itself to the hull and clicks in some way that the hull picked up and amplified. Story 28. I was on ship during Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf of Mexico. During the worst of it, the wind made the eeriest noises and the ship was creaking and making all sorts of metal-on-metal noises a ship shouldn't make. Story 29. I wasn't freaked out, but some people would be. On the mess deck area, there's a fan room off to one side that doubles as a mop locker with a janitor's basin installed. Go in there and it's pitch black. Turn on the light. Pretty much any surface was covered in roaches. And I watched all of that scurry down into the floor drains and any other openings they could get into to hide. Joe's apartment had nothing on that real-life scene. There was another moment which I'd probably count more weird than creepy, but it probably helped out in the big scheme. During one shift, I swore I overheard a heads-up rumor there'd be a drill a few hours later. So I'd amble by the DC locker area I'd be stationed at and check some things out while keeping my flash gear ready. It was also on my list of areas for cleaning stations, so it's not like I wasn't doing anything. Figured that'd save on running all the way from the work center or berthing to my station, and getting yelled at like usual for not being there ASAP. So being there on the spot did the usual thing, closing cutout valves at the station, right? Turned out not a drill, but actual fire incident involving some accident. What I did was quite minor, but I'd like to think the cutouts I shut kept that fire from being a much worse ordeal. And kudos to those geared out and actually fighting the fire that craps hard. There are also rumors of sponson ghosts relating to people that have jumped or fallen overboard, and some chief that took his life away in one of the lower compartments when dealing with a Dear John situation. Never saw or heard anything relating to those. There are moments at sea where it's boring as hell, and people do lose their minds a bit, so I can completely understand why those stories exist. However, my worst I could have died moment wasn't out in the ocean. I was one strip of painter's tape across the door from stepping out onto a sponson platform that wasn't there during overhaul in a shipyard during dry dock. It had to be about 10 stories down to the concrete below. Probably all of those were part of my reasons why I only did one enlistment, but it was interesting times nonetheless. Story 30, not exactly a crewman, but spent a lot of time out fishing with my dad when I was young. Scariest thing was a whale breaching like 10 meters away from us. My jocks were damn well dirty. Story 31. We had a naval chief petty officer passed away of a heart attack while underway on board our sub. Since we were doing spec ops off the USSR coastline, we could not surface and come off station for 60 days. So, every time we had to go into the freezer to get food, there was the chief laying on the shelf. Just think of having to look at someone's face looking back at you. Story 32. I worked on a cruise ship going from United Kingdom to Spain and back. Cross-channel ferry really but quite big at 37,000 tons, 2,500 passengers. We had a turnaround of about 4 hours in Bilboa, and at this time I worked in the restaurant, and after we had cleaned up, they started hailing a passenger over the loudspeakers to disembark. I remember he had a slightly comical name like Passenger Peckham or Passenger Pickles or something. Then the managers came and told us to start searching our stations for him. Every bit of the ship was getting searched, and they kept hailing him and us searching right up until the outbound passengers started embarking. They even had us searching in little cupboards and in the fridges, etc. Obviously, Passenger Pickles had jumped off in the night into the cold Atlantic. So another time, we were heading off at night during the winter gales, and about 5 hours offshore around midnight. I finished my shift and headed off to a crafty little platform at the stern, where I could tote my nightly reefer in peace. And I saw the massive bright ship spotlight scanning slowly and methodically back and forth across the waves. I guess this was for a jumper, and sitting there slightly baked, I could imagine perhaps glimpsing a last sight of some poor doomed soul struggling in the chop and wake before disappearing off into the vast, black expanse of the Atlantic. An office later confirmed the spotlights that night were for someone who had apparently jumped off a ship that had passed in the opposite direction. Story 33. I'm not a ship crewman. A buddy of mine is sailing the world and told a story about being adrift on glass-smooth seas one evening. He could have turned on his outboard motor, but he was in no rush, and fuel can get expensive. So, he decided that he'd just wait for wind to eventually come back. So, moonless night, no wind, no waves, but there's a strange mechanical noise out in the ocean. There are no lights, so he can't determine what it is, and his flashlight is completely useless. He considers that sound can travel a long way over a glass-smooth ocean, so he's not certain how far away this noise is. He starts considering that maybe it's a submarine, and he wonders to himself if submarines ever surface under other boats. So, the day after he tells this story, I go to work. I worked with Navy at the time, so I retell his tale and ask, do submarines ever run into other boats out at sea? Oh, yeah, happens all the time. Just Google submarine collision. It seldom means good things for the boat that got hit. Other people are joining the conversation to point out that All those collisions you'll read about, keep one thing in mind. They were all under power. They were making noise and we still just drove right through them. A sailboat? Adrift? Pfft. And the acing folk chiming in to mention that the transition between underwater and the surface is really damn noisy. So it's not like you can tell if something is right above you until it's really too late anyway. Story 34. This happened back in the 1990 AS. Not sure which year, so forgive me. I was aboard a 35-feet sailing yacht off of Key West with my at the time. There was a huge fire in the Everglades and the smoke had drifted down the Keys. It was so thick you could barely see your hand in front of your face, and to add to that, it was total doldrums out there, not a speck of wind or wave. Not another soul around for miles, or at least we thought. We were basically sitting dead in the water. No need to use the motor as we really had nowhere to be except for exactly where we were. At first it was really peaceful, just the sound of the sea lapping against the hull. Then we started to hear voices, not distinct words, but just raised voices. Nothing showing up on the instruments, but sound does travel far in those conditions. We thought little of it and proceeded with our naughty way to spend time at sea. Next thing we hear is the voices getting louder and they seemed closer. Still nothing on the instruments. Starts getting a little creepy when we both swear we hear those voices calling out our names. Sounded like Poseidon calling us from the depths. Clothes start going back on like real quick. It seems like the voices are getting closer and they are definitely calling out our names, totally raising the creepy factor to an all-time high. We decide that it's getting way too weird, so we start the motor and prepare to head back in. As we are preparing to turn about, a boat comes out of that smoke and right up alongside us. I swear I thought that was my last moment. Joke was on us. It turned out to be a bunch of our coastie mates who had seen us leave the harbor and followed us out, and they decided to have a little fun with us. Only time I said no. When they requested to come aboard, but a great laugh was had by all and the story was told in more than one bar in KW for years. Miss those crazy times. Story 35. I've spent about 9 years out at sea, and there were a couple of things that stuck with me. The very worst was a colleague hanging himself overboard on purpose, going next to a tornado off the coast of Taiwan and the massive waves around us. Hearing a PA from the captain to pick up a heavy tool and head onto the back of the ship next to the handrail, and it was not a drill. Turned out a ship that went past us in the opposite direction changed direction and started following us. Nothing came out of it. The very last one I remember was hearing a splash and start looking overboard to spot what fell in the water only to realize it's dolphins playing. Story 36. Woke up at 3 a.m. to a search and rescue alarm. I book it to the boat. We launch and end up cruising along for a few hours. Everything is pitch black. One of the crew members are looking over the side at the bioluminescent algae being kicked up by our wake and says he saw something big roll over in our wake. We explain it was probably a shark, and about 15 minutes later, a deep fog sets in. The fog is reflecting our running lights, so it looks like we are in a hallway or tunnel. Everyone gets a little more tense. We start keeping a close eye on the global positioning system, and then the fathometer alarm goes off. We are in 5 feet of ocean. The alarm stops. We're in 300 feet, and then 3, and then 250, and then 6 feet. Something was swimming very close to the bottom of our boat. It was such an eerie experience. We never figured out what it was. Perhaps whales? Or the Kraken. We got to the boat we were rescuing, and everything else was uneventful. There's something wonderful about being on the ocean in the middle of the night, but things can be very strange too. Edit. Running lights, not rubbing. Story 37. Had a dude who was the radio man on a container ship. Not an officer-rated position, but stayed on the cadet deck with the other halfway officers. As far as I understood, the radio man didn't do crap. Didn't stand watch. Didn't work days. Just ate crap. Took up space in the lifeboat and pleasure himself. I think the billet was some union stipulation or something like that. Anyway, this dude was the creepiest thing I'd ever encountered. His entire existence was centered around port calls, where he was the first one down the gangway and the last one up. Worse yet, he looked like if Santa Claus shaved himself from head to toe, developed a speech impediment, and sweated all the time. He would film his escapades and take pictures. At first, I had no clue what this dude would do in port. When I first joined the vessel, he asked me and my sea partner if we wanted to see some pics of his time ashore. We were like, damn, yay. He then busts out an old school album filled with dirty pics of him. I almost puked. From that point on, we kept our distance, but he kept trying to befriend us. Story 38. Maybe not relevant, but here goes. In the Marines, back in the 1980s, we had been at sea for only a few weeks. No problems, no food shortages, no worries, a great experience. For the infantry Marines on board the ship, the only problem was boredom. Boredom leads to frustration, and frustration leads to stupid decisions over small matters. I did not see this, but 2 bored, frustrated infantry personnel were in line for morning chow. A mess hall worker simply did his job by refilling the selection of those small, individual boxes of cereal. For some reason, the brand Lucky Charms had become the most coveted breakfast item in their infantry minds. When the cereal boxes were placed in view, one box of Lucky Charms was present. A fight ensued. More bored infantry marines joined in. Then more joined in, and a small riot had broken out for this one box of Lucky Charms. When clearer minds had broken up the fight, there was no victor as the cereal box had been destroyed and its contents spewed across the floor. One of the Marines thought he was the victor, as he was holding the largest piece of the destroyed box. When the shock wore off and the adrenaline faded, I'm sure the smile left his face. For infantry Marines on ship, boredom is the enemy. I did 20 years in the Marines and have more sea time than Popeye the Sailor Man, just an expression, and that was the first story that popped into my head. Story 39. I worked as an inspector on oil rigs, and we used ropes and harnesses to access the more difficult areas. I got sent with 2 other guys to do an inspection of a Pentagon rig in a bay in Argentina. It had been sitting there for a couple of years out of use. One of the cross-tubular braces needed to be checked. It was a floodable brace, meaning that when the rig was ballasted down, it would fill with seawater. It had an open hatchway on the underside with a small steel ladder attached. We abseiled down and managed to get in the hatch. The tubular was about 2 meters tall, so we switched on our head torches and started walking along the inside, moving our heads in circles to look for any problems in the torchlight. There's not much to see. The inside surface of the tubular is painted black, and at any time the torch only illuminates an area of a couple of feet. Then, about 30 meters in, as I circle the light up above me, 6 inches away is a white skull staring down at me. I screamed and ran back towards the hatch, totally freaked out. Eventually, we get brave enough to investigate. The skull is that of a seal. We worked out it must have swum inside years ago as the rig was submerging, failed to find its way out and drowned, then stuck to the roof underwater as it rotted. Finally, once the rig rose and the water drained out, it dried, but it stayed stuck there. Story 40. Had a friend go out night diving in Wellington Harbor. Turned around in the water and saw a monstrous great white swimming straight toward him. Turned his flash off for some reason. Story 41. I go to a maritime school for the specific reason to be a pirate joke. I had our first time at sea, and I was told during my deck watch to take the helm. It was a clear day but choppy waters. After I took the helm as a freshman and first time on a boat at all, there were huge waves for us being on a 540-foot cargo ship, which was refitted to be a training ship, added more holds for people to sleep in. So when I was on the helm, I see the whole ship in front of me and the water in front of the ship. We would hit the swells so that at one point you saw nothing but the bow and the blue sky, and the next moment you see nothing but the water and the bow, and in between the horizon would quickly pass by. After that, I changed my major to engineer. No wonder all those decals are unbelievably stressed out and huge holes for possibly the same reason. Story 42. I live in West Michigan, right next to Lake Michigan, which is basically a freshwater ocean. Anyways, I was salmon fishing all by myself one morning, and I hooked onto something in 150 feet of water. I set the hook and very quickly figured out that this wasn't a fish, and instead a very large snag. It was coming in very slowly, but I wasn't about to lose $100 worth of line and lure. A few days prior, there was a boat that sank in my area. No survivors of bodies had been found, and when I snagged this thing, it was only 80 feet down. I feared the worst. I concluded I was going to cut the line if I even seen a shape like a body. Sure enough, I see some dark mass coming up about the size of a body, but I kept pulling it in. Thankfully, for my own sake, it was a stray net that had rotting salmon and trout in it that had cut loose from a Native American net. I picked up and left that day and didn't launch out of that area the rest of the summer, as I couldn't stop thinking about what that could have been. Also, while this was going on, I hooked a fish and pulled out a 12-pound king salmon, but I let it go because I didn't want to eat it while thinking about what it could have been eating recently. Story 43. In the Navy. Finding flying fish on the 0-4 level, about 40 feet above the water, after a pretty big storm, or the one very hot day in the middle of the Gulf, I went outside to see some daylight. It can get a little unnerving being inside a ship with no windows, so it's nice to see the sun every so often. Anyway, I was standing by the 2 guns when all of a sudden I heard 2 loud, chest-punching explosions. I thought the hot temperatures cooked off the 20mm rounds in the guns. I ducked like an idiot. I ran back inside to hear someone complaining about a jet flying by at supersonic speeds. I never heard the exhaust or any sound from the jet, just the sonic boom. Story 44. I was supernumerary but still legally a crewman. Total power failure in the middle of the Atlantic, somewhere near the equator. You get so used to the sound of the engines and ventilation, and suddenly there's almost complete silence. Story 45. Not me, but my brother was stationed in Hawaii and is currently in the Coast Guard. His first week on island, he's told to investigate a homeless man who was spotted a couple of 100 miles offshore. Apparently, he wasn't found offshore, and the 2 men who called it in were involved in his death. He went on to tell me that a couple of longshore fishermen needed one more man for their voyage, but couldn't find anyone. So, what do? Obviously, go to the park and see if a homeless man wants to make a couple $100, duh. Anyway, while out at sea, the homeless guy, who was an alcoholic, started to detox, got disoriented, and fell overboard. The fishermen noticed him missing after a few hours and saw he fell overboard. They might have been anchored at that spot, I don't know. These guys call the Coast Guard, tell them they have a man overboard, get the guy back on board, and stuff him in one of the freezers. Story 46. This was a few years ago, maybe 2013 or 2014, so some of my dates may be a little off. I was on board a carrier in the middle of the ocean somewhere. We launched the last bird of the night and start wrapping everything up topside. It's midnight and was pitch black out, using only the light from the stars and the dim yellow-tinted lights off the island. My goggles were scratched to crap, so everything's just foggy and dark. Out of nowhere, it's as bright as day for a few seconds. So caught off guard, I look around like, what the heck? Look up in the sky and see a massive damn white light with a long-ass trail of fire. It looked almost like a jet with full afterburners shooting flames, but was so damn massive, it just couldn't be a bird. I started thinking it was just a big damn bomb. That idiot eventually went behind some clouds for about 5 seconds. Then we saw it again. This time you could see the fire forming around the front of the sphere-shaped thing. It was so massive in size and going so fast, it didn't take but a few seconds to go across the whole horizon of sea. Story 47. High seas. Takes about 30 minutes out at night to get your night eyes outside at night. At sea, the stars are bright enough to walk about on deck as if it were daylight. Changing watch stations, people coming from inside the skin of the ship can't see proper, so those with the night eyes walk around them like sharks in the waters. Kinda creepy, but you get used to it. High seas you don't get used to. Ocean swells so large that the ship goes sideways. Walking on the edge of the wall, telling yourself the ship won't fall over on its side. That inner pendulum screaming to run to the high side of the ship all the while. And there you are stuck inside the passageway walking on the wall. That won't ever not be terrifying. There's an arc bubble level on the bridge of a ship as a reminder of how far a ship can roll before capsizing. In high seas, that's the one thought on every mind. Now you land lubbers may not know this, but the ship's helm isn't steered by a ship's captain. It's a boring job that rotates every hour to maintain a heading on the compass. Depending on the seas, you can change that heading without changing course by too much. The helmsman can turn head-on into the seas, or side into them to let the ship roll a little bit more. Because some people don't get enough terror in their life, especially in the middle of the night. Story 48. My grandfather was in the Navy during World War II, Pacific Theater. He once told me a story about being on watch or something. He was alone at night, and staring down at the water, and they're going through a patch of bioluminescent algae. He said the colors were hypnotic and lulled him into something like a trance. He started feeling like he just wanted to jump in because it was so peaceful. Probably didn't help that it was during wartime and they were getting ready to invade Japan. When the Japanese surrendered, he said he never noticed the weight he felt under until it was all over. Like a dense fog lifted from the ship. He might also say kamikazes. He turns 92 next month. On an unrelated note, I always wanted to follow in his footsteps, try to be half the man he is and whatnot, and join the Navy, but I was deemed unfit due to a metal plate in my head from a pretty serious car accident in high school. Story 49. Underway on the edge of Hurricane Irene, you could look down the P-way and see the whole ship twisting. Taking a fuel with another ship 1,000 yards behind us, the swells were so high that when they were up, it would disappear. The fueler was taking on water on the tank. It was insanely tense and dangerous. I was on the fueling line, and when we would rock together, we'd take on about 20 yards of line. And when we'd rock apart, we'd get dragged 30 feet down the deck. Not a fun time. Story 50. Was being transported to observe a training exercise with a few others aboard a mid-sized Navy ship. We had an ensign assigned to us as a guide, and generally to make sure we didn't fall overboard or press the boom buttons, etc. I've never been out that far into open ocean before, and everything that was wow to me was causing this ensign to roll his eyes. Well, as we are underway for a bit without sight of land, the ensign was walking us below deck when we heard this incredibly strange sound. Started really faint, then got louder and louder, and then just stopped. It was some kind of mechanical, underwater siren-y thing that lasted for maybe a second or two. Everything seemed to resonate. One burst. That was it. The ensign's eyes got huge, and he told us to go back to our berth, bunks, until we are told otherwise. Then there was a real siren aboard and call to general quarters. Lots of people running around, and concern on faces. Turns out we were pinged by a non-NATO nation sub in an area specifically off-limits to that type, nationality of vessel. Not much else happened, but people were spooked. Many of the crew thought that it was the start of something world-changing. It wasn't. Story 51. Not my story, but my grad advisor. He's a sailor, and after getting into grad school, he took a year off to sail the world. He was in one of the last long legs, South Africa to Brazil. He accidentally turns off the autonav thinking it was the stove. He was also the cook. Thinking, oh crap, he quickly turns it back on and fries it. The following is a good 3 weeks of not knowing whether the captain or the only other sailor will go nuts and beat him in his sleep for ducking up. He bailed in Brazil and took a plane home. Story 52 was on a fishing trip off the coast of Oregon. This was about a year after the big tsunami in Japan. The captain saw something off in the distance, so he went to look. It was a small refrigerator with Japanese writing on it. Just creepy to know that probably washed out of someone's apartment. Story 53. This didn't happen to me, but when I was about 9 years old, I started conversation with a man who worked at the museum I was wandering. We sat in front of a trilobite case, and he told me about when he went with his girlfriend to Europe. I can't remember specifically where he was, but the two of them were on a boat in the middle of the ocean and started to notice bioluminescent algae. He said they tossed little things into the ocean. At the time, I didn't realize that was just littering, and he said it was sweet to just watch it with her. But after a while, it started spreading and they couldn't see where it was coming from, but it was huge. He said they both got really freaked out and stopped watching it, but that he'd never forget how gorgeous it looked. He was a really nice guy. We became friends, and he showed me all around the museum. When I met back up with my grandma, he ran out to his car and gave me some small fossils he'd found on a dig in Colorado. I'll never forget that guy, or his slightly eerie algae story. Story 54? I was stationed on a ship for a year during my time in the United Kingdom Navy. Our first trip during my time there was from Norfolk, state of Virginia, to the Mediterranean for 6 months. On the way back, we hit a huge storm. There were waves as big as a shopping center slamming into our little amphibious group. I was on what amounted to a mini carrier, so we were barely rocking. I was standing at an opening on the side of the ship, sheltered from the worst of the storm, watching the other two ships struggle to make headway and sort of laughing about it because they looked like they were rocking much worse than we were. Suddenly, a monster wave hit the Barnstable County, a very small first ship, about frigate-sized, right in the bow, and she disappeared for a good 15 seconds. All I could think was, I just watched a whole ship sink, all hands lost. Oh crap. Then, out of nowhere, it just leapt out of the middle of the wave like a giant tusked primeval sea behemoth from a Sinbad movie. I just about jumped out of my skin. Story 55? Not creepy per se, but scary as hell. Sailing in the North Sea 3 a.m. in a force 6 or 7 on a 60-meter brig, 2-mast pirate ship looking thing, was on watch on the port side of the open bridge wing, part of the command part that extends on the left and right side. There are a lot of gas rigs out in the North Sea as well as the big metal posts that used to hold the rigs up with buoys to mark them to navigate round them. Spotted a buoy, calling to the helmsman, and when visibility is down, you full arm point at the buoy. If they can't hear you, they can see where you are. After about 5 minutes, the buoy light disappears. Panic sets in call out. I've lost it. Spotlights along the port side scanning the waves to spot the buoy or the post. All of a sudden, peering into the darkness and reflections of the spotlights, this monolithic pole comes screaming past, about 10 feet narrowly missing the lower mast spar. Captain, a grizzled Irish man, just said, "Be lucky you're alive to crap yourself." Story 56. Not a crewman myself, but my uncle used to work on fishing boats. I recall asking him this question once, and his reply was along the lines of, apart from being in a huge empty space, with no chance of rescue, the scariest was when we were navigating at night through thick fog, when all of a sudden me and a deckhand heard a roar. Before we knew what it was, a wall of gray was inches away from us. He explained it was a container ship, literally within touching distance of a medium-sized trawling boat. And he also used to talk about the time they were pulling the net in and realized there was a mine in it, so they just cut the net loose and marked the spot on a map. Story 57? Friend works on a cruise ship casino. Out at night on break, he and a buddy see a distress flare. Call the wheelhouse to inform the captain. When he finally gets around to it, the flare is gone. Ocean is dark, so they move on. There was a vessel in distress that used their last flare to signal a ship, and it's passing them by. Story 58. I'm prior United States Navy. A few years ago, I was deployed over in the Pacific, and we were informed that a Malaysian airline plane was possibly hijacked. The plane never landed anywhere. It was then deemed a crash. We spent weeks looking for that plane. Several U.S. ships, planes, and helicopters searched day and night. On top of that, several other militaries from multiple other countries joined in on the effort. After a week, we weren't expecting to find survivors, but we never found anything. I don't think they ever found that plane or any of the passengers. I was told they found luggage, but I believe another plane also went missing. And I think it's around the same time, another commercial airline was shot down in the same area. I'm pretty sure this stuff made the news, but I was in the middle of the ocean on a destroyer and couldn't watch the news, so I never got to follow up on it. Story 59. When I was younger, my family and I were on a friend's pleasure craft in the middle of the Thames River just downstream from Electric Boat, submarine base, factory. The owner powered down both inboard engines so we could relax and have lunch. About an hour later, we see a submarine heading for us on its way out to sea. The owner tries to get the engine started, but they were not turning over. It was 10 minutes of watching this massive sub slowly making its way towards us while the owner struggled to get boat going. With 100 yards remaining, we finally got the boat started and got out of its path. I like to think that they would alter their path to avoid hitting us, but at 11 years old, I was convinced we were going to die. Story 60. I'm in the Swedish Royal Navy. Scariest situation I've been in was during a storm in the Baltic with waves measuring up to 10 meters in the tops. As we set course homeward, we had extreme difficulties keeping the heading, since we then were forced to take the waves from the bow sides, causing some serious rolling. We have this device, gadget on the bridge, which tells us how many degrees to one side we're rolling over. In normal rough weather with a crappy heading, of course I've seen it measure up to 20 degrees, and that's not comfortable at all. During the crazy storm, I was horrified every time I managed to look at it since it measured up to 35, 40 degrees to each side. Which means when we went deep in a roll, I was basically standing on the walls and windows of the ship seeing the ocean crashing in on us hard. We got really drunk when we made port that night. Story 61. Sailing across the Pacific, had a faint ping on the radar right side. Followed us for a few hours. Could not find it visually, it was night. Also while navigating through the South China Sea going through fishing vessels. A tanker was sitting in the middle of the fishing boat. Didn't see it visually until we went by. It turned on its running lights and tailed us for a few hours. Very closely. Working on a United States-owned vessel, we were instructed to be on the lookout for suspicious vessels. This one definitely qualified. Another trip there was a search and rescue transponder signal about 10 miles out. We altered course to intercept. As we approached, it looked like a fleet of small fast boats and one larger one. If anything was sinking, they definitely were being helped. But looking with the high-powered sights, nothing was wrong. Nothing about the situation seemed right. We quickly turned back for fear of known pirate attacks in the area. Story 62. Not sure why I'm replying because I work on a towboat on the inland waterways, but I will. It was about 3 a.m. I was hooking a rope to a tree on the bank in the middle of nowhere in the swamps of Louisiana when I hear, "Hey, you need some help?" Thinking one of my crew members got up early and came help, I say, "Sure." It's dark, and I didn't even think twice to check. I'm screwing the shackle pin in when my flashlight hits his bare feet. I look up to see some strange-looking dude. Finished up quick, jumped back in the skiff, and got back to my boat quick. We looked on the map when I was telling the captain about it, and there was nothing around us but swamp and thick woods for at least 7 miles. Story 63. I was bosun on a 3-masted schooner. We were sailing down the coast of Brazil, and our lookout spotted something orange in the water. Checked it out with binoculars, determined it was a life jacket. So we put the rescue boat in the water, and myself and another crew member went to retrieve it. Turned out it was a child's life jacket, lots of growth, and all the distinguishing marks had faded on it, so it had been in the ocean for a while. Thankfully, no child came out with it. No idea where it came from or what happened, but pulling a child's life jacket out of the water is a sobering experience. Left us pretty chilled. Story 64. About 4 years back, I was involved in a rescue operation in Australia. Wasn't uncommon to hear of the immigrant boats going missing and getting the normal, keep a good lookout and report messages. This particular boat was estimated to be carrying about 80 people and a full operation was carried out. The second night of the search, my cadet called me to the bridge wing where I got a glimpse of a body in the water. We quickly lost sight of it and couldn't tell if it was living, but it was face up. We turned around, did an intensive search, but never saw it again. That face will never leave me. Story 65. Found a wrecked up yacht off the coast of Bermuda with one dead man and one half drunk and injured man. We thought no one was alive until the one guy screeched at us. Story 66. I was a ship's captain in the Israeli Navy. One day we got a severe weather warning, so I headed back to port. On the way there, we encountered an Egyptian fishing boat. These boats are typically very colorful, so you can't mistake them. I stopped by the boat and said to the other captain that a big storm is coming and he should go back to port. He waved to me, but I could see that he didn't take me seriously. A few days later, after the storm came and went, we went out to sea. I found the colorful wreckage of the fishing boat floating in the same area. Must have been 5 men aboard. So sad. Story 67. Passenger on very large cruise ship traveling across the Pacific. We are 3 days out from the nearest land. Water, the right of me. Later to the left. You get the idea. And someone spots an overturned boat. This boat was maybe 15 feet, and was the type that had no business being out in the open ocean. The cruise ship turns around, stops for about 30 minutes, and then begins a spiral search pattern to spot the boat again. Hundreds of passengers are perched along the rails trying to find the boat, and finally it is sighted. The cruise ship launches boats who go out to investigate. They take pictures of the boat and hull number and return. The story goes that it looks like it's been out there for a while and probably washed out from Japan for the tsunami. By maritime law, they have to stop to investigate, but the whole scenario was surreal. Especially the cruise ship going in circles. Story 68? Not me, but my dad's a captain and has some stories. Apparently, there's some seasickness medication that's also mildly hallucinogenic, which has caused some problems in the past. Notably, one dude who had never been that far out to sea before, just ripped off his life jacket, said, "I didn't sign up for this," and tried to walk off the back of the boat. They had to restrain him, after which he went kind of dead in the eyes for a few hours until he recovered. Another dude claimed to see a dog running around on deck, which is significantly less creepy, albeit still weird. Story 69. Not a crewman, but used to sail a lot. One day, sailing with my dad a couple of miles off the south coast of England, we spotted something in the water. Got closer to find it was a struggling scuba diver. Hauled him up the transom ladder with difficulty and got him settled in the cockpit. He had been diving alone from a beach and got swept out to sea and was exhausted. He was okay, but if we hadn't come along by chance, I can't imagine he would have made it out alive. Very lucky. He managed to break the key off in the ignition for the engine with his air tank. Was an absolute idiot to get the engine started and get him back to shore. Story 70. Not me, but a great uncle. He was in the Merchant Navy in the 68S. One day he was cleaning near some machinery when I noticed a guy standing on it, knowing it was dangerous, and as far as he was aware, inaccessible. He told the guy to get down. The guy didn't respond, and my great uncle didn't recognize him, so he went to get his boss. When they got back, the guy had vanished, and his boss told him about somebody matching. The guy's description fell onto the machinery and passed away the previous voyage. Story 71. So my dad was working in the Navy about 20 years ago, and on one of their tours, some of the crew members went to see a fortune teller person. She told them that people were going to die on board ship. They all laughed it off and carried on sightseeing. That evening, a helicopter was supposed to land on the ship to pick up people and transfer them home. However, instead of landing, it just crashed and hit all crew in the helicopter and a few others, and they passed away. Story 72. Commercial sailing, shipping route between Hawaii and Los Angeles. Captain was a salty, hard-looking man who owned a coffee plantation on the island. Story comes up one day about the captain's nickname, Captain Killer. Apparently, one of the days the ship was in port, Captain's wife came on board and was visiting him. A crew member got drunk and visited the captain to complain about how hard he was, work, etc. While the crew member is doing this, he makes a rude remark about the old man's wife, who is sitting nearby. Captain Killer stands up, walks around the desk, and punches the man in the face. Man goes on. Head lands on edge of cabinet behind him, and passed away right there. Captain doesn't get charged with anything and continues sailing until he retires. Story 73. Sailed across the Pacific from California to Hawaii. One night, while motoring due to lack of wind, we ran over an abandoned fishing net drifting aimlessly in the water. It wrapped completely around our propeller, and we had to stop immediately. It was one of those nights with intense bioluminescent activity of plankton in the water. Every time we jostled the net with our gaff to try and dislodge it, the whole massive net lit up like a submerged Christmas tree mixed with a tentacled beast. Somehow, this made the idea of jumping overboard to untangle it by hand even less appealing. We waited until morning to untangle ourselves and carry on towards Hawaii. Story 74. Underway about 10 nm from Cuba, heading to Puerto Rico. First watch as bridge officer. Surrounded by heat lightning, and suddenly out of nowhere, we were beset on all sides by bright glowing blue jellyfish, equally spaced about 10 feet apart, and all you could see in any direction. It was otherworldly, as we silently pushed through the night through a field of glowing circles. Story 75. Not a crewman, but once on a fishing charter, I had a bite on a line that ran, stopped dead, then went slack. Pulled it in and found that something had bit clean through a 50-strand steel leader like it was nothing. Asked the skipper about it, and he said, "That idiot has stolen at least 3 fish off every charter I've run for the past few weeks. Keep an eye out." Tossed some chum in and walked off. About 5 minutes later, I watched a white shark swim by that was so damn big I'll never put a line in the Pacific again. I spent the rest of the trip getting high in my bunk and praying to make it in safe. Story 76. The Phantom Crapter, I was active duty for a few years on a destroyer. When we were out to sea on certain for exercises, someone would randomly drop a deuce in one of the ways around the combat or sonar areas. It went on for months and months. No one could figure out who it was. We even had a watch roam, never caught the person. Sadly, you could tell how his diet was going or how upset their stomach was. It was gross. Story 77. First time seeing St. Elmo's fire, standing on deck at night and parts of the ship start to glow, more and more parts start glowing. It's really creepy if you don't know what it is. Later, you can see electric arcs an inch long coming from parts of the ship. You can even pick them up on your fingertips. Story 78. When I worked on a cruise ship, I was on the switchboard, and a passenger called down to say they had seen a body floating in the water. Having to call the bridge and relay all the information and then stand out on deck searching was a horrendous experience. We spent about 3 hours looking, just going in circles. All we found were life jackets floating in the water, so we assumed it was a migrant boat. We were in the med. Also, another time an elderly passenger called down and said he couldn't wake his wife up. She passed away. I'll never forget that. Story 79. My father's side of the family comes from an island that mostly deals with sea-based occupations. The creepiest thing was to be out sailing with my grandfather as a kid and listening in on the radio when another ship started taking in water. We got close enough to see, but were too late to save anybody. To make it worse, the families of all the sailors liked to have their radios tuned in so they could follow as well. Coming back to find that the wives and children of the now drowned sailors were shadows of themselves was horrible. Nothing needed to be said. They all knew. Story 80. We sailed the ship to Singapore from Western Australia. We sailed past about 10 miles from the location of the Air Asia crash in the Java Sea in 2014. We listened on the radio as they requested body bags to be brought out and sailed past a blow-up model Air Asia plane and a broken teddy bear. I have plenty of interesting stories after working at sea for 15 years. This would be the closest to creepy, though. Story 81. There was a dead on my ship a few years prior to when I first got my billet. Guy take his life away. As I was doing a clean sweep one night in the sonar trunk, I hear crying. I check around to see if anyone's around, but there's no one. It goes on for a few more minutes before I hear a small crash and what sounded like a manila line going taut and swinging. There was never anyone there, but I never went down there alone again. Story 82. My big brother has been working out on the ocean for many years. The craziest thing he ever found was a dead elephant floating out there. The thought gives me the creeps. Me, I just found a random-ass swarm of bees. Story 83. Not a crewman, but went out deep in the Gulf of Mexico to fish for marlins. It was clear skies for miles, and the water was very calm for being so far out. We were getting ready to head back to shore when the boat started rocking, then tilted at a good 45 degrees. There were no lines in the water, and the tilt lasted 6 seconds before stabilizing as if a big hand let go of the boat. No one knew what caused this. It's almost like one side of the boat completely lost buoyancy. Story 84. Offshore, the Northern California coast was foggy and creepy warm for some reason. Lots of green glow in the water casting weird shadows. Swore I heard and saw a gold rush paddle wheeler off in the distance stalking us. Story 85. I worked on a diving boat on the Great Barrier Reef out of Cairns. We had a skipper that was a bit crazy, but usually harmless. Just a big mouth and foot and mouth syndrome, with angry little man syndrome too. One time we were looking for the meat cleaver because it wasn't in the kitchen and we have to secure everything, especially the knives before we move. Well, we find it under the pillow of the skipper while he's sleeping, clinging onto it. We encouraged all the passengers to sleep on deck and we kept watch so that he wouldn't come up and kill us all in our sleep. Story 86. Probably halfway across the Atlantic, we come across an upturned sailboat. No record of it, as far as we can tell. On reports, no sign of survivors or bodies. Story 87. Not a captain, but a Coast Guard helicopter pilot. I'm seeing some stuff. Most disturbing was a group of us-bound migrants tied together in the middle of the Florida Straits, all dead. A lot of migrant ventures end this way. They attempt the passage in overloaded, unsafe vessels. When their boats sink or capsize, they try to stay together, sometimes tying themselves together with line. Eventually, they succumb to the sea if not found by others in time. Story 88. Miles and miles offshore on a sailboat, we came across a dozen or so shipping containers floating in the water. It was creepy sailing thigh them all, and a bit nerve-wracking thinking we might do our boat some serious if we hit one at the wrong angle. Story 89. I go to one of the nation's maritime academies, and on our last trip to Europe, we passed an overturned sailboat getting circled by sharks. It was eerie knowing anything could have happened, but when we called the Coast Guard, it looked like an insurance scam. Story 90. The bioluminescent algae in the Persian Gulf at the right time of the year in still enough water makes the ship look like it's cutting a hole through space and letting the stars out as the algae lights up with our disruptive presence. Story 91. Spent my time on a fairly big sailing ship in the German Navy. We were in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean at the time, and for the night shift, you had to stand 3 hours all by yourself at the rear end of the ship and stare out into the dark like a night watch. And I swear near the end of this damn watch, I started hearing water splashes and saw small things like seahorses following the ship. Complete nonsense, I know, but I definitely didn't fall asleep or something. Story 92. I was underway on my ship. We were hearing this repetitive noise that wasn't active sonar, drilling, or a sub. It was a little bit weird, and I was able to pick it up on my passive narrow band display and my passive broadband. There were no other ships in the area, and it wasn't ship's force banging on the hull. We were stumped a little bit. Also, we were in the med between Cyprus and Israel. It wasn't biologics. I know what cetaceans sound like. Crap, I can hear those in my sleep. I wasn't the bloop either. Story 93. A guy on my deployment jumped overboard in order to miss the rest of deployment. Someone talked to him right after he got picked up, and he said after he jumped, he came up almost immediately, turned around, and the ship was gone. 1,000 feet long aircraft carrier just disappeared. Nothing but pitch black. Scared the crap out of him. Story 94. My great-grandpa was in the Navy, and he swore till the day he died that one time he looked out at the water and saw countless hands reaching up out of the water. Story 95. We stopped in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 1,500 miles from any land. It was very warm, so a number of us decided to go for a swim. Everything was great until I decided to look underwater and realized that metal floating in water is something that messes with the brain and that the ocean was incredibly deep. And who knew what lay in the deep awaiting us? Story 96. One time I was out boating with my family. I was probably 10, 12 years old out in the Puget Sound. All of a sudden, a sub raised up out of the water about $100 away and radios us to leave the area. Not really creepy, but still kind of cool. Story 97. Not a ship crewman, but me and my dad were pretty far off the coast of Florida and came across a medium-sized boat just floating out in the middle of nowhere. It looked pretty weathered, like it had been out there for a while. Searched the cabin and below deck, absolutely nothing. Just some scattered items and a picture of a family. Not really creepy, just kind of eerie. Story 98. I was sailing across the Pacific doing a night watch when I saw 3 glowing torpedoes come straight towards our boat from the side. I tried to change our course, but didn't have time. Turned out it was 3 dolphins coming to play with our boat and traveling through phosphorus algae in the water. They played under the bow of our boat for almost an hour before heading on. Story 99. My great-granddad was a deckhand over in Britain. One day he arrived late to work, for whatever reasons, and missed his ship setting off. Initially distraught, fearing losing his job, it later turned out the ship never reached its destination weeks later and was never found. Morale of the story? Sometimes it's okay to be late to work. Story 100. There's nothing creepier than thinking you hear shouts of help from overboard in the middle of the night and not able to spot anything. The wind is creepy.